And welcome everybody. A few folks are still joining us now, so we're getting ready to begin. My name is Christine Shupla. I'm from the Lunar and Planetary Institute in Houston, Texas, but we have a marvelous group of panelists with us from AGU who are, we're going to be introducing them in just a second. Let me turn off my YouTube sound. All right. And yeah, where is everyone from? It sounds like we've got people from Oslo, from Alaska, from here in Houston, of course, Washington, D.C., Scotland. Wow. Okay. Margaret from Menlo Park, California. Portugal, and no conferences this year from Portugal. JPL, we are so glad to have all of you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's go ahead. Hi from Spain. Sherelle, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. And while we're on that next slide, so we have several really very well-informed people from the American Geophysical Union who are going to be talking with us about communicating with policymakers. And so I have a question for those of you who have joined us so far. Let us know, have you attended one of our Sharing Planetary Science seminars before? These seminars that we are giving for planetary scientists, for planetary engineers, for early career grad students, postdocs studying planetary science. And I am going to give you 5 more seconds to finish voting. 4, 3, 2, and 1. And it looks like we're kind of split, half and half. Half of you have attended a lot and half of you haven't attended any. And there's a few of you who aren't really sure if what you've attended before is one of these or not. So Sherelle, let's move on to the next slide. And let's go ahead and let our guests introduce AGU and themselves.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Christine. And thank you to everyone for being here. We really appreciate it. Great to see all of you. Just a real brief introduction of AGU for those of you who aren't familiar. We're an international nonprofit scientific society of Earth and space scientists, including planetary scientists. And we host the world's largest Earth and space science meeting, which we were just talking about a few minutes ago, as well as over 20 scientific journals. We also have a really robust outreach program, including our department, Public Affairs, which is the science policy arm of AGU. All right, next slide. Great. I will just introduce our speakers for today real quickly. You may have seen these bios before, but I'm Elizabeth Landau. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at AGU, and I'm joined by 2 of my colleagues, Brittany Webster, who's our program manager, and Lexi Schultz, who's our vice president. We have many decades of experience in the science policy amongst us. And so we're really excited to be here and share a little bit of that with you today. Next slide, please.
Let's go ahead and mention, sure, let's go ahead and mention here at this point, throughout today's seminar, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A at any time. In addition to that, you are welcome to also enter your thoughts and comments in the chat. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, I'm also monitoring the YouTube. So if you post a question in the chat, in the chat on YouTube, I will eventually notice it and we'll pass that along to our speakers as well. So please feel free at any time. And we've actually already got our first question, but I'm going to let us get rolling. And then I'll, when we get to a good pause, I'll break in with it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Christine. All right, next slide, please. So we're going to jump right into it. We have a lot of content. Please do drop questions and comments in throughout, and we will address them, and we'll try and leave a good chunk of time at the end for discussion as well. So I'm going to start today by talking about why it's valuable to work with policymakers and how you can better understand them as an audience and how to effectively communicate with them. Next slide, please. So why talk to policymakers about your science at all? I think we might get on the wrong slide here, Cheryl. It may seem intimidating. It may frankly seem a little bit useless sometimes based on some of what you hear in terms of politics. But policymakers are the ones who can change laws, they can write bills, help out communities. Thank you so much, that's perfect. They can also choose to use science as part of the basis of bills or not. And so it's really important to be able to get scientific information to them. And I have helped hundreds of people meet with policymakers for the first time. And most, if not all of them, were pretty intimidated before their first meeting. But at the end of every single day of meetings, they would say to me, that wasn't nearly as scary as I thought it would be. It's just like talking to anyone else. And so it's important to keep this in mind when you're thinking about taking that next step and working with policymakers. It's important to ensure that they are getting science into those bills that they're working on. Next slide, please. So let's think about policymakers as your audience, as someone that you're going to have a dialogue with. How do you ensure that you're going to communicate with them in a compelling way? Next slide, please. At its heart, science communication, whether it's to policymakers or to any other audience, is really about forging connections. And this shouldn't be surprising to any of you, but I do want to spell it out explicitly and emphasize that. Next slide, please. It's not about just sharing facts. This is a little complicated of a slide, a little more complicated of a slide than I like to put up, but it's an important one. And it's just one figure of many that demonstrates that people's willingness to see climate change as human caused is really informed by their political ideology. So you can see along the y-axis, it's showing the probability of belief, and along the x-axis, it's showing their education. And it's essentially showing that the more educated someone is, the more entrenched they become in their beliefs, which are often part of their political ideology. So it's really not about the scientific knowledge at all, but about that political ideology in many cases. So the greater the knowledge, the more entrenched they become in their own views. This may not be surprising to some of you, even though it might be a little depressing, but I use it to demonstrate that there are even data out there showing us how useless it is just to give people more facts. That is not going to fix this problem. And while the study was on climate change specifically, this theme has been shown to carry over for many different topics. So for those of you who are wondering how to get through to those people who seem to be refuting science, just sharing facts isn't the way to get them to understand or care about what you're trying to share. Lexi's going to talk a little more about this later on, but the key is really building relationships, finding those common values, and then talking to them about the issues as a trusted resource to whom they will listen once you've built up that relationship. It does take a little more time and effort, but it's the best way to make real change. Next slide, please. So in order to get policymakers to listen to you, you need to figure out why your research matters to them. And this isn't necessarily just why your science is cool or exciting, although that may be part of why it matters to some people. What's really important is to think about it from their perspective and figure out what they will find valuable in what you do. Next slide, please. So it's really about framing your message for the audience. And what does this type of framing look like? I have a few examples here. This is research framed to appeal to broad policymaker audiences by making the science relate to their constituents and communities. So in the first example, I'm connecting planetary science to health. And in the second example, I'm connecting it to lives and property and saving each of those. So these are just a couple of specific examples. And I understand that sometimes this means looking at the bigger picture of what your field can accomplish. And then you can walk that back and talk a little bit more about your specific work and research and how it contributes to that bigger picture. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little more about framing. When framing your message, don't feel like you're trying to sell someone something. You're simply presenting scientific knowledge in a context that is important to the policymaker to whom you're speaking. Find something that they care about and talk about how your work helps that. I'll share more information on how to do this in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. I also find it really important to address the topic of expertise when talking to scientists. You all have worked so hard for so long to be an expert in a really specific topic. And the nature of scientific research can make us forget how much we know generally about our field and about science when compared to your average person. So I want to remind you that when you're speaking to an average policymaker or their staff, you are the science expert and you can speak broadly about your field. So I have an example that illustrates this. In 2011, we had an earthquake we felt here in Washington, D.C., which was quite unusual. And the local papers wanted to cover the earthquake. They called AGU and asked for a recommendation of a seismologist they knew could talk about it. And so we called a great local seismologist we knew, telling her that the paper would love to talk to her about the earthquake. And she said to us, "Oh no, I couldn't talk to the newspaper. Those are not the kind of earthquakes that I study." And we had to convince her that they weren't going to ask her about slip mechanics of specific types of earthquakes or anything so specific that she wouldn't be able to answer their questions. We reassured her that she's still the expert and she knows so much more than the journalist about earthquakes, and she'd be able to answer all the types of questions that they would have for her. So it's the same thing with policymakers. You'll be able to answer most of the questions that they have. And if they do ask something that's outside of your area of expertise and you really don't know anything about it, you can always connect them with a colleague who can help them out. Next slide,
Liz?
please.
It seems we have a question. Margaret, did you want to ask a question live?
Okay.
Oh,
that's
maybe.
All right.
That's okay. You can put it in the chat too, or we can answer it later. Sorry about that.
Well,
all right.
While we've paused here, though, I know that you'll be getting to an event that will be hitting this. The first question that's on the Q&A also is long-term, what is the most effective method or methods for communicating to policymakers? So I know we'll be, you've already said, building a relationship. We're going to hear more about that, yes?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll talk through a few different methods, including setting up meetings with policymakers, which is a great way to get them to know them and their staff members. And it's also great to be able to keep in touch long term, which Lexi's going to talk about later, with lots of follow-up, which can be emails, phone calls, or virtual meetings as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. All right. So if we could get the next slide, please. I wanted to talk about another aspect of being able to share your science effectively with policymakers, which is ensuring that the language you're using is accessible and compelling. And I want to emphasize that simplifying language, removing jargon, and defining any industry-specific terms is not dumbing things down. It's just speaking the same language as your audience to ensure that you can communicate effectively. And you can definitely maintain accuracy while using language that anyone can understand. It's great to also start with the big picture. And then if the policymaker is asking questions, you can elaborate. Policymakers and their staff will definitely ask for more detail if they need it. Next slide, please. Jargon exists in every industry, and science is absolutely no exception. AGU has developed these jargon postcards as a kind of humorous way to remind scientists to think about what words they use that could have multiple meanings. To avoid jargon, you can either find another word or phrase to use instead, or you can use the term, but then define it so the policymaker knows what you mean. If any of you can think of other science words with multiple meanings, please do drop them in the chat. These are often fun to figure out. Next slide, please. So I also want to highlight a recent study which shows that scientific journal articles with less jargon actually get cited more, likely because more people can understand and utilize them. It's the same thing when you're speaking with others. Make your work more accessible to a wider group of people by dropping jargon. Next slide, please. So we actually have some great worksheets to help remind you and to practice. Christine is going to be sharing this with all of you. So you'll have access to these. They're great to pin up around the office or have on your desktop computer just to check in and make sure that you're really thinking about what words you're using. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to talk in a little more detail about how to effectively communicate with policymakers, including doing research to figure out what they care about, determining an effective message and ask, and how to have effective meetings with policymakers. I'll kick us off and then Brittany is going to jump in. Next slide, please. So hopefully at this point you are thinking about the value of sharing your science and working with policymakers. So how do you do this effectively? There are a few key pieces to think about to make sure that you are being really effective in your communication. You want to think about what your goals are, specifically what you're trying to accomplish by starting this dialogue with a policymaker. You want to look and do some research and figure out what the policymaker's goals are so that you understand what it is that they want to accomplish and what they're interested in. And then look at that policymaker's values, interests, and concerns. And I'll show you how to do this. And that really helps you with that framing I was talking about earlier to ensure that you are conveying your message in a way that they're going to care about it. And I want to note that although there are similarities between policymakers, the answers really may vary by person. So if you want to talk with multiple policymakers, you'll need to do that research and prepare a plan for working with each of them individually. Okay, next slide, please. So doing your homework, start out by doing some research. It's really easy to do this online. You can check out their website and see what press releases they have out, check out their social media and see what they're sharing. You can figure out what some of their goals are with that information, and then you can make a connection between their goals and your research explicit in your message. Next slide, please. So here are some helpful resources for looking at federal policymakers specifically, and I'll talk about local policymakers next. So it's really easy for federal policymakers because they have really robust websites. What you can do is go to their website, which is generally their lastname.house.gov or .senate.gov, and you can see their biography. Look at what job they used to have before they became a federal policymaker. Look at what committees they're on. This shows what subject matter they're working on when they're creating bills. Look at what caucuses they are part of. That helps you figure out what their interests are. Their legislation and voting record is available online as well. You can check that at congress.gov or other sites. That helps you see what have they voted on similar issues in the past. If there's a particular issue that you're interested in talking with them about, how did they vote on that? Did they support it or not? And that'll help you figure out how you can frame your message to be really effective. Social media is also great to see what they're interested in, what they've been tweeting about or posting on Facebook. That will help you see what issues they're really interested in, and you can figure out how to tie that to what you're communicating. And then government relations folks are a great resource too. If your institution doesn't have them, AGU is here to help you out with that, or other scientific societies of which you're a member.
So Elizabeth, you would recommend that people sort of cyberstalk which Congress people they might want to approach and form a relationship with.
Absolutely, Christine. It's a great way to get information, and it's really easily accessible. All right, next slide, please. So I also wanted to talk about local policymakers, by which I mean anyone who isn't a federal policymaker. This could be town, city, county, state, tribal, or others. I highly recommend the Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally website for information on local engagement. They have things like step-by-step guides to figure out how to engage depending on which local policymakers you want to work with. They have a database that has science engagement information and lots of ways to talk with policymakers locally. And I know there are a number of people who are joining internationally. And so while some of the specific websites I pointed out are US focused, I do want to note that generally being able to find this kind of information online is a great way to start out when you're looking for policymakers at any level or location. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we have a poll. If either Christine or Sherelle would mind launching that. Thank you so much. So we'd like everyone to let us know, have you contacted policymakers about your science research before? And please click as many as apply. Maybe you've done that by mail or email, by phone. Maybe you've actually gone to visit them in person when that was an option. Or maybe some of you were just thinking about it, not sure how to, not sure whether you could or should. Please do go ahead and click whatever is appropriate there in that poll. We're really interested in seeing where everyone is and see if we can get a range of answers here, or see if maybe everyone's really active. We'll just give it another minute here. Christine, how's it going?
We've got 63% of them have voted. We're going to give you all 5 more seconds to finish voting. 4, 3, 2, 1. And here's the results. A lot of people, but a lot of people say not yet. A third have said not yet, but they plan to. And another third are still not really sure whether they should.
This is so interesting. Well, I'm glad that all of you are here, regardless of where you are in this poll, because I think we have information for all of you. And I hope that we'll convince a few of those people who aren't sure that this is something that's worth their time. Wonderful. Thank you for that. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is my last slide before I hand things off to Brittany, but I did want to switch gears briefly and talk about how you set up that first meeting. If you're thinking about, maybe this is it, maybe I do want to dip my toe and have that first conversation. So a few ways that you can get started. Many policymakers will have contact information or a form on their website if you want to set up a meeting with them. They have, so many people who are filling this out constantly. They're meeting with hundreds, if not thousands, of constituents every year. So, absolutely feel free to do this. It's not a big deal. You can absolutely do that. Another way to get in touch is to call the office. They'll have their contact information on their website, and ask for the science staffer. You can leave a voicemail for them, or you can get their email and then send them an email. And you want to send either a brief email or leave a brief voicemail, just asking them to set up a meeting with you, letting them know what you'd like to talk about generally. This can be just a sentence. I'm a planetary scientist and I wanted to talk about my research and how it impacts the local district. Something like that is all you really need to say to set up a meeting. And then if you can, state your connection to either the office or the committee that you want to talk to. So maybe it's your federal representative, or maybe it's a science committee and you want to talk to them about a specific bill they're working on. Any of those are great reasons to set up a meeting with an office. Virtual meetings have sort of become the new go-to. So absolutely feel free to have a virtual meeting. That can be video or phone call, whatever is easier for you. But that's a great way to be able to have a meeting where you don't have to go all the way to the office, particularly if you're trying to speak to someone federally and you may not be in the Washington, D.C. area. That's great too. And then one important thing is you absolutely want to plan what your message is for the office, which Brittany is going to talk about doing. I will just note that oftentimes you will be meeting with staff people as opposed to the policymaker themselves, particularly if you're going to a federal office. And that's fine. They're the ones who are doing the subject matter work anyway most of the time. So they are wonderful people to meet with. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Brittany, who's going to talk more about how you actually plan and act in these meetings.
And as we're switching things over, I'd love to hear more from each of our panelists here. What are some different reasons that scientists approach Congress people or other policymakers? As Elise pointed out, she maps salts on Mars. we may not think that Congress has an interest in that. What are some reasons that scientists approach their policymakers to initiate this back and forth, this discussion, this becoming somebody that person might turn to for input in terms of science policy?
Yeah,
So-
it's a great question. Oh, go ahead, Brittany. You want to start?
I was going to say, I'm actually going to talk about this in my first couple slides of my section. But so why don't we go, I think we have a poll right now. So why don't we go to that? And then I can speak a little more while people are maybe filling out the poll. Wonderful.
Okay.
So love to know at what level people are interested engaging with their legislators. And I will also say, I think Lexi's kind of been alluding to this in her responses, but a lot of times, and I think like Liz also alluded to this, a lot of times it's not really thinking about your particular science, but think larger. Like, why are you studying salt on Mars? Like, like kind of digging a little deeper, but also, or perhaps thinking broader. Like, why is salt on a planet important? Like, what does that have to do with the processes of a planet, and why is that important? I think, right now we're advocating for science funding, and a lot of times we make connections between planetary and Earth science to showcase that, you can't really have one without the other. The Earth is a planet. It's our, very unique, important planet, but it's also a planet. And by studying other planets, we learn a lot about Earth. And so like, there's a connection right there. Okay, sorry, switching gears a little bit. Exciting to see that people are interested in engaging with both. I think more and more, we see the importance of engaging at all levels as well. So thanks for responding, folks. Yes, we will talk a little bit more about people feeling hostile as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. Next slide. But yeah, so just to close off that thought, I realized I didn't. Just want to say that, yeah, there's a lot of ways to think about your research and your work. And sometimes, it might just be talking it out with someone who's perhaps not a scientist, but it's always really digging down deeper, I would say. And also thinking about what are the reasons that you're studying what you're studying? How did you get into this field? All of these can be really interesting questions to help you figure out how you might form a connection with your legislator. So I want to start with the general flow of a meeting. And I'm going to use the terms policymaker and legislator pretty interchangeably, mainly because we predominantly deal with legislators here at AGU. But the general flow of any meeting, you're really going to start with introductions, and immediately after that, you'll make your ask. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Then you're going to talk about why your ask is of interest and important. And then ideally, your message will include some sort of story. Then you'll move into discussions and questions. By now, hopefully you've already been engaging in a dialogue and having some back and forth with the person you're meeting with. But if not, this is the time to stop and ask questions of that person and try to engage them in a discussion. And then you'll want to thank them for their time and promise to follow up. And finally, you'll really want to be sure to actually follow up after your meeting. And I'm going to talk more about each of these elements in turn. Next slide, please. So an ask is basically, what do you want from the policymaker or legislator you're meeting with? Next slide, please. There are a few things to think about when considering what you want your ask to be. You want to make sure it's specific, actionable, and achievable. Make sure the staffer can walk out of your conversation and take action towards what you spoke about. Something to keep in mind is that if you're attending a meeting as part of a group, you want to make sure the constituent makes the ask. They're the person in the room with the voting power and the one who staff want to hear from the most. Next slide, please. Although it might seem really weird to walk into a meeting and ask for something, policymakers and their staff expect it and find it incredibly helpful. So you'll see the bottom chart, the one that's very long, is kind of is the one about how helpful offices find it when people they meet with have an ask. And the one on top is how often constituents actually have an ask. So it's really critical to have an ask when you go into a meeting. Next slide, please. So what exactly can you ask for in a meeting? There are a variety of options, but we'd recommend keeping it to no more than 2 asks. And here are a few categories of things that you might want to ask for. So you might want to ask them to support or oppose a specific bill or amendment, or you could be asking for robust funding for a specific science agency or program, or simply that they protect current funding. And just a note here, if you work directly for a federal science agency, you cannot ask for funding for that agency, although you can talk about the value of the work your agency is doing. And someone else in your meeting, if they do not have the same restrictions, could actually make the ask. If you receive funding from an agency through a grant or a fellowship, you can actually ask for funding for the agency that funds you, and often actually showing, being there and showcasing the work and the value of the work that you do can also be just incredibly persuasive. So the third type of ask could be about maybe supporting an issue, perhaps joining a caucus. And for those of you unfamiliar, caucuses are kind of informal member organizations on the Hill that members of Congress join in order to show that they support an issue. So for example, there's the Planetary Science Caucus, there's been a NASA caucus at some points, there's a caucus for almost literally anything. And the fourth is the relationship ask, which is basically talking to a legislator and saying, use me as a resource. And do not overlook this one. Relationships are very valuable. Next slide, please. So some of you might be thinking, okay, well, how do I make a relationship request specific, actionable, and achievable? So some examples might be you invite your legislator to visit your lab or facility. Maybe you want them to write an op-ed or piece for an institutional or organizational publication, or maybe you want them to be a part of a town hall event or other event on a relevant topic at your institution. Next slide, please. Here are some questions to consider, but really this is all about knowing your audience. If possible, you want to think of an ask or your ask or frame your ask in a way that benefits both you and the policymaker or legislator. So to give you a common example, maybe your legislator really wants to be known as a supporter or champion of an issue. So, and you want to draw attention to an obscure or not well understood issue or project. So the two of you might come together to host an event on that issue. They get to be potentially in the media or at least get some coverage about how they, are championing this issue or drawing attention to this issue, and you get to actually draw attention to your issue or project. So that's how you could create kind of a win-win situation with the relationship request. Next slide, please. So a couple of things your ask should be. It needs to be within their power. So for example, your member of Congress cannot tell your mayor to do something. Excuse me, Congress has no oversight power over local officials. It also can't be outside their position on an issue. So to give you a planetary science example, asking your legislator to triple funding for a mission to Venus when they've authored a bill to defund all Venus space science missions is not really realistic. Although it would be reasonable to try to convince your legislator of the value of studying Venus, it's not really reasonable to ask them for something that's blatantly in opposition to their stated positions. Also, an ask like this just shows that you didn't do your research on the office, and that's generally not a good thing. And finally, you want your ask to be timely. Maybe your Venus space science mission is hitting an important milestone, such as sending back its first pictures. That could be the perfect time to engage your legislators on your mission in some capacity. Going back to that event example, maybe that's the perfect time to have an event about your mission. Next slide, please. Following your ask, it's time to make a compelling case for why your legislator should act upon your request. Next slide, please. So I want to start by clarifying the difference between an ask and message. So an ask is what you're asking of the office, and the message is the framing that you use to show that your ask is also important to their office. This might be obvious to you, but that doesn't mean it's obvious to the office. Next slide, please. So messaging is really all about where can you find connections between your ask and work and the legislator. What are the hooks that you can use to show them that your work is important? You have to really look at it from their perspective, not your own, and make sure you adjust your message to make sense according to the legislator's values. And this is just something that you're going to have to really do for every legislator. We all know that science is valuable, but you might have to explicitly show them how your work is related to something they care about or is valuable. As much as possible, aim at connecting your work with the state and or the district. For example, does your university stimulate your area's economy and bring in constituents? Do you bring a particular value to your geographic location? Try to make it as specific as possible. And just for that last one, like a good science example might be that, you know, you're a PI on a mission, and so now you've brought in all these grad students and you're just bringing kind of maybe perhaps a claim to the institution, or perhaps it's you have your own lab, and again, you're bringing grad students, you're bringing kind of, you're funding a bunch of people running your lab, and again, you're building kind of the reputation of your institution in the district. Next slide, please. So this is really about the value of telling a story. And there's actually lots of science showing that telling a story is a great way to connect with people. People remember stories better than facts or figures, so there's that focused attention. And science has shown that brains mirror each other during storytelling, which creates connection. And it also increases trust, which is important to build relationships. Science actually lends itself really well to storytelling. In your work, perhaps there's a coming of age story you can tell about your own development as a scientist, or perhaps the development of your field, or perhaps there's a mystery to be solved or a quest to be undertaken. And if you're interested in storytelling, AGU Sharing Science, which is our science communication program, is actually doing a series of webinars on storytelling for scientists this year. And I'll also just leave you with this thought, which I think really drives it home. Data makes you credible, stories make you memorable. So do your best to carry both into your meeting with you. Next slide, please. And really, if you remember one thing from my talk, it's really this. It's up to you. I'll just say, you know, legislators can have literally a dozen meetings in a day about a dozen different topics. So you really want to use your time wisely, and really do some prep and homework before you go into your meeting. Next slide, please. Just a couple of meeting tips. I think the ones I want to hit on are really, it's important to be flexible, even in a virtual environment. Things happen, especially on Capitol Hill, as we've seen, like there can be literal fires or exciting events happening on Capitol Hill. So sometimes you just need to be flexible. It's also really important to stay on topic. I've especially seen when members of Congress enter the room, people often lose focus. But again, if you only have 20 or 30 minutes for your meeting, it's really important to stay on topic. And then I would also say, keep politics out of it. Again, the staff or the member of Congress, they might get a little political, but I encourage you not to. I strongly encourage you not to. You know, the science policy world and Capitol Hill are both very small worlds, and you want to leave as many doors open as possible. And then Lexi will talk more in the next section about creating a leaf, about the importance and value of having a leave behind. And finally, this is really important, I would say, especially for scientists. If you're asked a question and you don't know the answer, don't speculate, just offer to follow up with them and provide that information then. Next slide, please. So often you only have 20 to 30 minutes, as I mentioned, in a meeting, so please be concise. And then also, if you find yourself lecturing, make sure that you have a couple of questions in your back pocket that you can kind of pull out to draw the policymaker or their staff into a conversation. And again, it should feel like an ebb and it should feel like a give and take. It should not feel like a lecture. Next slide, please. And finally, follow up. And next slide, please. The first step in following up, and Lexi will talk more about this, but the first step is really just sending a thank you note, thanking the office for their time following your meeting. And you also, in this thank you note, you want to remind them of your message and maybe even some exciting science happening at your institution. If you have a leave behind, this is a great opportunity to attach an electronic copy of it. And if you do like a PDF version, it's also really helpful because you can include exciting graphics or also hyperlinks to more information. And then, yeah, and Lexi will talk more about this in the next section. So with that, I will turn it over to Lexi.
Thank you so much. And and go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So I just want to talk about building relationships. So there's been a lot of discussion already in the chat. So I do want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. So I'm going to move through this somewhat quickly. We've talked about this a lot, but the reason you want to build a relationship with a policymaker is that ultimately, if you want to see some change, or you actually want to have the ability for that policymaker to turn to you for advice, they need to know you. If you really think about if you have a topic that you need some input on, or that you're interested in learning more about, you're less likely to do it to the person you chatted with in line at one of the events at a conference, and much more likely to do it with someone you've known for a number of months or years, or you've had multiple exchanges with. And that's the bottom line. Congressional offices and other policymakers are exactly the same. And so that ongoing relationship is really important. So the meeting or the conversation is just that first step. Next slide, please. So again, what we're talking about here, and I'll talk more about this, is building that trust. And that trust, it's something that Liz started talking about in terms of understanding where your policymaker is coming from an audience standpoint. What do they care about? What can you possibly connect with them about? And I know in some cases that might seem challenging, or your kind of initial assumptions may block your ability to say, I just have nothing in common with them. But generally speaking, that's often not true, even on topics of science. I dropped one example in the chat, and others have been dropping in other examples, but someone may even be so far as a complete climate denier, but incredibly supportive of space research, or incredibly supportive of investments in satellites. Or they may have a scientific facility locally that you can actually refer to because it's your home state or district, and they will be big champions for that state or district. And then there are other issues as well. Investing in the future of America, economic strength, our health, our well-being. So there are always connections that you can find, but you have to be willing to kind of think in that way in order to build these relationships and the trust. Next slide, please. So Brittany talked about following up immediately. This is a great chance to send the leave behind, to get there, to make sure that you say thank you, follow up on anything you said you would follow up on. But the most important thing, honestly, is making sure that your name and email address are in their email queue when it's recent enough so that they still know who you are. That starts that ongoing dialogue. And then communicate regularly. So often enough that they don't forget in between, not so often that it seems like a pain in the neck to you or burdensome to them. And so, quarterly is not a bad idea. Monthly, if you feel like there's a hot topic that's happening, or if that's not too burdensome on you. And I'll talk a little bit more about what you might want to communicate with them about, but think broadly. It doesn't just have to be about a specific bill or a paper that you've written. Respond promptly. I think somebody addressed this in the chat as well, but the ideal circumstances, they see you as enough of a resource that they're asking you questions, maybe science questions, maybe about something in the state, maybe about policy language that they'd like input on. Always get back to them right away. If you know the answer, that's fabulous. If you don't know it right away, but you think you can research it or get the information, ask them what their deadline is. But still respond and say, hey, you know, how long do I have? And then they know that you're responsive to them and you can then follow up. And if frankly you think, well, I'm just not the right person for this, see if you can come up with a name to send them. You know, another colleague or an expert that you know of in the area. So again, you're being responsive. Again, that builds that connection. And I have a note here, participate confidently. And there's a real mix of experiences in this group. But if you get asked to do something that maybe is outside of your current comfort zone, let's say to testify at a hearing or speak at a press event, I would really ask you to kind of take a deep breath and consider whether this is a chance for you to, one, really elevate yourself as a trusted resource in the area of how science connects to policy. Two, whether you have some really key information that is really interesting or important to add to the discussion. And if those things are true, then say yes and reach out for the help that you might need. So many of our colleagues have actually taken part in these efforts, but you don't always know until you ask. You can reach out to us at AGU, to other associations, to your own institutions. Very often there are media offices or government relations offices. And just, you know, if you need help, ask for it. Please do not be afraid of doing that. And of course, if you're just not ready to do this, you can always decline, but do consider whether you can, again, suggest another name or a resource for the office. Next slide, please. So what kinds of things should you be communicating about? A follow-up on your original topic. Let's say it was about funding Venus, incredibly important. We all know. So, you know, if there's something that's been happening there that you know about, by all means, continue that dialogue. Maybe there's something that you heard about that's a bill that's moving that you're interested in, either in your area of research or something else. Like we started talking about sexual harassment in the sciences. If that's of interest to you, you know, that may not be your research, but it's still a bill that's moving. And, you know, if you want more information on that sort of thing, AGU has a resource. You can sign up for science policy alerts. A number of associations have ways you can keep informed and on top of things that might interest you. Maybe something's been happening in your area of research. Was a new mission just launched or funded? Did your facility add a great new wing? Was there some new discovery? You know, did you do a new paper or article that the office might find interesting? Go ahead and send that on. But remember, 8th grade audiences, simple language, you know, watch the jargon. News pieces. Members of Congress really pay attention to news outlets. They see it as public opinion. So maybe there's an opinion piece or an article that you think really represents a good point, something that you think they should know about. That's a chance for you to send that on and just say, hey, wanted to make sure you saw this. I think this is incredibly valuable because. And then the invitation. Brittany spoke about this, but that invitation to see your lab or facility, I would check in with your institution or government relations folks if you do that, or an invitation to take part in a town hall. That's an amazing way to build that longer term relationship, because very often, and I apologize, I've got motorcycles going by here, but very often that gives you actual time to spend with a congressional office or with some other policymakers. And that time is just a way to get to know each other and to like break down barriers. And I've seen so many press releases. Members of Congress are excited about these opportunities and they like to tout them. So that's a great way for them to get excited about your facility as well. So definitely think about that as a possible opportunity if you haven't already. Next slide, please. Again, what we're talking about here is trust. I like this slide because the whole point is you don't start at a place of trust right away. You know, it's funny, even with an office that you think might be completely aligned with your values, they don't necessarily know who you are or know that you're, you know, like a credible resource until you establish that kind of dialogue, until they get to know you better. And this is especially true for audiences that might be, you know, skeptical. I once had a really great meeting with a climate modeler from Iowa. We went in to see a very conservative office who, you know, had been sort of a professed stated climate denier. So we weren't going in there to talk to him about some sort of climate policy or something. But the scientists knew a number of the people that the Iowa representative knew, and his research was really, really important for Iowa farmers because the climate models were valuable for those kind of extra seasonal forecasts that farmers use to decide planting. And that kind of shared connection, they kept the conversation going. And this member of Congress was very, very supportive of this scientist's research, even though he was a climate modeler. It was just about those shared connections and values. So, you know, really, really interesting approach. Next slide, please. Okay, how to make a one-pager. So this is this leave behind. Next slide. So why would you do this? Frankly, it helps policymakers remember you. If you have, so we call it a one-pager. It can be two sides of one page, but one of the key things is it's short and it's got all the information in there in a compelling fashion right away. It's also really great for sharing your expertise and your contact info with other stakeholders. You know, you may be at some a community event or, you know, a different type of science event locally. It's almost like a calling card for some of your work and who you are. It allows other scientists to understand your work. There was the piece that Liz put forth about how papers that don't use jargon get cited more. I mean, we all like to think that we are completely understandable to those outside of our disciplines, but that's often not the case. So putting something really, really simple together can be really helpful to scientists and other disciplines as well. And it also is a good chance to promote yourself, frankly, and the work that you do and why that's important and what makes it valuable. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an animation. How do you make a one-pager? Again, make it brief and understandable at the 8th grade level. You want to have visuals. You want it to be have graphics or pictures, really compelling visuals. You want to have that ask. You want to know, okay, if you get a policymaker to read this, why are they going to read it? And make sure that you have explanatory information that's understandable and kind of go through those messages. And finally, don't forget that this is about you. Include your contact info and a little bit about you. We've seen some like great pics or some quotes from people's Instagram or social media stuff. Make it a little personal. Let them remember who you are. Next slide. And along with the materials that are going to be shared with you, we have a worksheet to get you started. The front page of this is tips for creating one pager, and the back sheet is just the back side of this sheet is just the here are all the elements. Write it out. What's your ask? What do you want to share about yourself? What are some of your key messages? It's just we try to make it really, really easy, and we also have examples online. Next slide, please. Okay, and just a few final thoughts. Thank you for your patience for all this. Next slide. We know that science is at a challenging point, and it can feel like the public just doesn't get science and so forth. Well, this graph is a little old, and I would actually think amongst many in the general public, this might even be up. But what this is showing, the bottom line, is that people like the scientific community basically more than they like any other community besides the military. And that it can feel like that's not the case, but it is true. And it is even true in a bipartisan way in the halls of Congress, as well as other nations. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind that some of the, the assault on science that we feel is sort of our perception of it rather than total public view. And next slide. This might be my last substantive slide. Yes, as Liz said, just remember you got this. You have colleagues even on this this webinar that have done this before. It is you can absolutely do this, and it is absolutely valuable to do. You are a constituent as well as a scientist, and even if all you're doing is saying to your office like, hey, my university, my institution is in your state, and I'd really like you to understand what we do here and how it contributes locally. Nothing else. That is a valuable thing to do. It's important that, policymakers understand that and understand how important it is to, a district, a community, and the local economy. So with that, I will stop. I think the next slide just says questions. Yes. So there's many questions in the chat. Hopefully some of these have been answered, but I would say please feel free to, raise your hand, write a question, we'd love to have some more conversation about all these issues that have been coming up.
And it looks like Hunter's posted one asking, when you talk about advocating for a bill, does this mean discussing a bill that's already being considered or a piece of policy you would like them to create and that you're attempting to build and gain support? So sort of what's the boundary there between generating policy versus advocating for policy and how that results in change?
Brittany, do you want to start on this one?
Sure. So I guess I would say it can be both, but I would say most often, and this is definitely the lawyer in me speaking, not every idea or problem requires legislation. And sometimes you don't want things in law, not least of all because the average bill takes 7 years to pass. So I would say I would probably approach it more, so two ways. If you have an idea or you have a problem, I would more share that that you either have this idea or you have this problem and ask your legislator how they might help you solve it. Because one, there might be a piece of legislation that does this already that you haven't discovered. So one, maybe also do your research. But two, they might be able to find out if there is a piece of legislation out there that is attempting to solve this problem. And then you can have the discussion about whether what they're doing is a sound idea or not. And the reason you might also want to work with a legislator or a science society such as AGU, if you have this, if there's not a bill that you know about there, we're a little over 100 days into this new Congress. There have been 2,000 bills introduced in the House thus far. So that's a daunting research project. But yeah, it can really be both. And also too, something we didn't talk about, but members of Congress write letters to get things moving, for oversight, to address issues. And so it might be that legislation, that there might be some other tool in the policymaker toolbox that you're not aware of, but that they might be able to take up to either advance or solve what have you.
Thank you. Now, Joshua had asked that question that we've sort of addressed about effective methods for communicating with policymakers. I was wondering if maybe while we're waiting for the next question, everyone who has joined us might want to enter in the chat of all of the different methods of communication that we've heard, which one resonates the most with you? What are you thinking about doing now? What are your plans at this point? So please go ahead and enter in the chat what you're thinking of based on everything we've heard. And what other questions do people have?
I'm also really interested, there were some people who said they're really not sure that they should communicate with policymakers. And I'm interested if anyone still feels that way, what some of the continuing sort of hesitation or concern is about, and if we might talk about that.
Let's go ahead and let's relaunch that poll then. Now that you've heard this, what are you thinking? Your answers as to whether or not you might not have changed in the past hour, but what are you all thinking now? We've got a couple of points here from people in terms of what they're thinking about doing. Thank you so much. And we're just about out of time. I'll give everyone 5 more seconds to finish voting. 4, 3, 2, and 1. There are still some people who aren't sure whether they should, but that percentage is a little bit smaller. So than before. And while we're here and finishing up, please continue to add ideas and questions. There's a question here from Mark. Discussion about building relationships, but terms like climate denier that might poison a relationship with many politicians. Is there a trick to reconciling the two?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I used that term, which was in some ways fairly sloppy of me to do that. But if you are going to an office that has publicly questioned sort of climate science, you actually don't bring that up. necessarily. In some cases, you don't even start by talking about climate change. Again, the example I had used was the scientist who started talking about the value of his work for farmers and talking about seasonal forecast modeling. It was all climate science, but we didn't talk about it in that way. And so you end up talking about the substance and trying to get out of some of the words. It's often, the point that you're making, which is that it's hard to build trust if you come in from a place of contempt. The work from home model, the cat walking across the laptop. But it's hard to build trust if you come in really, from a place of negativity. You have to have some openness of mind in order to say, how can I find that connection? So if you need to take a deep breath, if you need to think about your body posture, which is something that came up in the chat, those are all really excellent points.
And I also just want to say, at least on the federal level, there are a couple of, I'm going to say, diehard members who are slightly ingrained in their positioning at this point on climate. But I think more and more, it's rare that you walk into an office where they're not completely comfortable talking about climate science. Now, how they talk about it and how they frame it is going to differ widely from office to office. But I mean, it's a conversation that's happening on Capitol Hill, much more than you might think.
Thank you, Brittany. And Ray has a question Lexi's answering now. Lexi, do you want to make any comments? And then Sherelle, can you go ahead and move us to the next slide, please, as well?
Sure, I'm happy to answer this live. We've invited legislators or congressional staff to take part in our meetings, fall meeting and other things, and they've come. They've been actually really valuable speakers. And we've actually worked with students in some of our networks for the students themselves to invite policymakers to come talk. And those have been really, really, well done and well appreciated by everyone. It ended up being small roundtables of students with policymakers. So, there's been a variety of approaches, but that's always an exciting thing to do.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So we have some websites here, and we are going to be posting all of these marvelous handouts from AGU on the LPI's Scientist Engagement website, the same place where we've had the announcement about today's webinar. Please join me, everyone, in thanking our panelists for joining us today and for their time. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for all of our attendees who joined us. If you have additional questions, you are welcome to reach out to me, but I also pointed out in the chat earlier, I think, Sherelle, one of the slides, if we keep going, is going to get us to the website. And we have somebody who's raised their hand. Let me go ahead and turn on their microphone as well here. After I find where they went. So anyway, there you can see some information there. And I think, Sherelle, one of the other slides is going to have that one. Thank you so much. We wanted to let everybody see the websites here at AGU and the email address for AGU. Any final questions or comments before we call it done?
Just again, really want to thank those who shared their own experiences, and continue to invite those who are interested in doing this to keep going and to give it a shot.
Thank you all so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.